This week in wrestling history, we begin with two famous WWE title changes, one for which there is no known footage, and the other title change is not even acknowledged by the company. 47 years ago this week, on December 1st, 1973, Stan the Man Stasiak pinned Pedro Morales to become WWE Champion. Back then it was the WWF title, at a house show in Philadelphia, ending Pedro's reign as champion at a whopping 1,027 days. Kind of puts things into perspective when you think of the big 434-day reign for CM Punk. That might be big for today, but that ain't nothing compared to some of these title reigns we had back then. According to Stasiak's friend Frank Dusek, Stan had worked with Pedro many times, always losing, and he was fine with that. He got to work the champion in main events. He got paid very well for doing so he didn't have any issue with that. And he assumed the finish on this night would be no different. According to an article on the Wrestling Classics website, Stasiak relayed this story to Dusek just like this. He was sitting in his dressing room when in walked the road agent, and he already in his head, he knew how the conversation was going to go, because the conversation was always the same. The agent told him Pedro makes the big comeback and gives you a belly-to-back suplex. Goes, yep, okay. The referee goes down to make the count. Stan is tying his boots, and he says, right. And then the referee counts 1, 2, and at 2, you roll your right shoulder off the mat. Now, he's paying closer attention, figuring they're probably doing a false finish. It's going to lead to, Pedro's big top rope splash for the win. But then the agent says Pedro's shoulders are going to still be down, and the referee is going to hit 3. Now, Stasiak drops what he's doing, and he just stares at the guy. And he goes, you mean I win? And the guy goes, yes. And he looks at him, and he goes, is this a title match? And he goes, uh-huh. Says, you mean I win the title? Goes, yes. He's getting frustrated now. Goes, yes, you win the title. And that's how it all went down. Stasiak did not even know he was winning the championship until just before the match, just before he went out. Whatever it was, an hour or two later maybe for the match. And because they were afraid of inciting a riot, they never announced Stasiak as the new champion. Instead, the ring announcer said, let's hear it for a great champion, Pedro Morales. Everybody left the building that night thinking that Pedro had won. They waited until the following Saturday on television to announce the title change, and Stasiak got a whole 9 days as champion before dropping it to Bruno Sammartino in Madison Square Garden, which kicked off Bruno's second and final run with the title, which lasted a little over 3 years. That is after the 8-year reign that he had the first time. They wanted the belt back on Bruno, but they did not want Pedro to be the one to lose it to him, and so Stasiak became a transitional champion. No known footage of the match exists. I've tried to find it over the years. I've looked for it. You will find footage of another Morales-Stasiak match, actually a series of matches they had, but that's not the one. So there is unfortunately no footage of the match or the title change. 41 years ago this week, on November 30th, 1979, Antonio Inoki beat Bob Backlund in a match in Tokushima, Japan to win the WWE Championship. Although WWE does not officially recognize his title reign, it is one of those phantom title changes. But yes, Backlund did not, in fact, enjoy 5+ years uninterrupted as the champion, even though WWE would have you believe that he did. It took place on day 1 of Backlund's tour over in Japan. About a week later, on December 6th, they had a rematch, this time in Tokyo. And Backlund won, but there is some controversy involved in how he wins, and it appears that the referee reverses his decision and they hand the belt back to Inoki, who ends up vacating the title right after this. 3 days later at the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, Backlund still is being billed as the WWF champion. Lost to Pat Patterson by countout. And then 8 days later at Madison Square Garden, when they ran the Garden pretty much every month back then, Backlund beat Bobby Duncan in a Texas death match to regain what people did not realize was the vacant championship. They never told the people that it was vacant. Backlund came to the ring without the belt. He was never introduced as the champion, even though the last time people in the Garden saw him, probably the month before, he was the champion, but they didn't introduce him that way. And the then WWF president at the time, Hisashi Shima, he showed the title off to the crowd before the match. And I mean, maybe some people may be expected, or not expected, but suspected something. But most people probably just thought, okay, well, here's the president of the company, and he's holding up the title. I guess it's just a title match. Backlund's defending the title against Bobby Duncan. And nobody thought anything of it because there was no internet. How would people know? How would people know they did this phantom title change over in Japan? Backlund won, and it was like any other Bob Backlund title match at Madison Square Garden. Now, in his book, Backlund said the reason they did the switch was it was done as a favor to Inoki, to keep him on the same level with Giant Baba, who had, a couple of short title reigns of his own with the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship. It was an ego thing. But as far as the WWE is concerned, Bob Backlund won that title in 1979, and he didn't drop it until he lost it to the Iron Sheik in 1983. 29 years ago this week, on December 3rd, 1991, just 6 days after their Survivor Series pay-per-view, WWE tried a little experiment called This Tuesday in Texas, offered on pay-per-view at a lower price point, just $12.95. It was an experiment that obviously did not work, or else they would have done more of these types of shows. It would be 13 more years before they tried another Tuesday night pay-per-view, and 4 years before they started the 2-hour in-your-house shows at a lower price point. I see websites online saying that this pay-per-view did 400,000 buys. I don't believe that for a second. It looks like it was actually somewhere around 140,000. It was said to be in the range of what the WCW pay-per-views were doing at that time. And in looking up the buy rates for the WCW pay-per-views back then in 91, that's around what they were doing. And 140 is the figure that I've seen, which makes more sense. It was a short show. It was only about 90 minutes, built around a rematch between The Undertaker and Hulk Hogan, after Undertaker beat Hogan for the title at Survivor Series with an assist from Ric Flair and a steel chair. We went through that last week, that whole fiasco. In the days after, Undertaker defended the championship at some live events against the British Bulldog. In the rematch, President Jack Tunney, he was seated at ringside. He was there to make sure there were no shenanigans this time. Ric Flair got involved again. Jack Tunney took a bump, a rare bump for Jack Tunney. And with him down, Flair tried to get involved, but it backfired. Hogan reached into the urn. He threw ashes into the Undertaker's eyes like any good babyface, and he rolled him up for the win. And after this, the title was declared vacant and put up for grabs in the Royal Rumble match. Macho Man Randy Savage wrestled his first match since WrestleMania 7 against Jake the Snake Roberts on this show. Coming off the snakebite incident, Macho Man got the win. But the real drama, the real memorable part of this came after the match was over, when Jake Roberts slapped Miss Elizabeth right across the face in one of the most shocking things that I have ever seen on a wrestling show. Unless you were a fan back then, you cannot understand how shocking it was to see Liz abused like that on TV, or to see a WWE even just run a serious angle like that. There was no comedy here. There were no jokes on commentary from Bobby Heenan. This was played up like a serious situation. Like a blood feud between two men that had gotten so personal, and Jake slapping Elizabeth was just what was going to send Macho Man completely over the edge. I mean, that is one of the things I love so much about this feud. It was more real than most storylines were in that company at that time. And it's a crime that it did not get a proper blow off of WrestleMania. this may be my favorite feud of all time. I feel like it's the Mega Powers stuff or this may be my favorite. And as much as people do praise it, it's hard to call it underrated because people do praise it. I very rarely hear people say bad things about the feud, but I still feel like it's underrated because it doesn't get talked about enough. Because it just didn't play out long enough. Or if it did have that big WrestleMania match, then yes, it would be talked about a little bit more. For as much as people do talk about it, I think it should be talked about even more. This is probably my favorite of all time. The promos before and after the match from both men were fantastic too, especially from Jake. Jake used the lyrics to a Pink Floyd song in his pre-match promo. He said, "Cold as a razor blade, tight as a tourniquet, like the skin on a dying man." Even though he screwed it up, that's not exactly what he said. He said tight as a turning key instead of tourniquet, but it still sounded evil, coming from Jake Roberts. And in a dark match at this event, which did not air on TV, Ric Flair pinned Roddy Piper. And I cannot understand, all these years later, I still cannot understand why this did not air on the pay-per-view. The two of them were feuding on TV at the time. They shot angles between them, but they never had a match on TV. They had plenty of matches at the house shows, but never any that were televised. And I wonder if part of it had to do with Roddy. Roddy Piper did not do many jobs. I don't know how he got away with it, even when he feuded with Hogan back in 84 and 85. He never lost clean to Hulk Hogan. If he lost, it was a count-out or a DQ thing. Even with Hogan at his peak, somehow Piper got out of having the job straight up to Hogan. Bundy lost to Hogan, Stud lost to Hogan, Andre lost to Hogan, Savage, everybody, Boss Man, everybody lost to Hogan. But Piper, he was very well protected. He did not do jobs very often. But I can't imagine in this case, I mean, Flair was like one of his best friends. He was probably happier than anybody that Flair came to the WWF. But maybe it was him. Maybe he was just very protective and he didn't have a problem doing it as long as it didn't air on TV. And I will say this, when he lost to Bret Hart at WrestleMania a few months later, it felt like a bigger deal because of that, because you never saw Piper get pinned on TV. So, I mean, it kind of worked out, but I just feel like that would have been, it just would have made complete sense on a show like this where you really only have two matches that you're promoting. Throw a third one and do Ric Flair against Roddy Piper, but they kept it off air. Also wrestling in dark matches that night, Ron and Don Harris and Sir Charles, who would go on to become Papa Shango, among many, many other things in his career. 22 years ago this week, on December 1st, 1998, at a Monday Night Raw taping in New Haven, Connecticut, Stone Cold Steve Austin and Mankind beat The Undertaker and The Rock via DQ in the main event. What happened after the match created a bit of controversy when Undertaker and his ministry members handcuffed Stone Cold to a giant version of The Undertaker's logo and raised it above the, not the ring, they were on the stage, raised it high into the air. Austin was probably suspended a good 20 or 30 feet in the air, arms outstretched, making it look to a lot of people like a crucifixion. The Catholic League was none too happy about this and said, mocking Christ is not within the parameters of acceptable theatrics, even in professional wrestling. At this time of year, it is particularly egregious. Bill Donahue of the Catholic League called WWE to complain about the angle, and when they asked him about what suggestions that Bill would make, he made one that they found acceptable. And Donahue said, this can all go away if the next time this happens, the crucified wrestler, quote-unquote crucified wrestler, extends his hands directly over his head instead of stretching them straight out. And WWE agreed to that and said that's perfectly acceptable. See, look at that. Crisis averted. But that is still one of the more memorable scenes in Raw history. Undertaker, eyes rolled back in his head, posing down below with Austin above his head, arms outstretched. A few days later, on December 6, 1998, shortly before going on the air for WWE's live Capital Carnage pay-per-view, it was one of their UK-only pay-per-views that they did at that time, from London, Jim Ross got a phone call from his wife, Jan, telling him that his mother had passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack at the age of 64. And then then he had to go on the air. And then while he is live on the air during the pay-per-view, he starts to suffer another, this would have been his second attack of Bell's palsy. And I think the first time he had an attack in 94, I think he just, as he tells the story, I think he woke up on Super Bowl Sunday, I think in 1994, and he realized that he was either having an attack or overnight he had an attack, and he could see it when he looked in the mirror. This was not in his sleep. This was not overnight. This was live on the air during a pay-per-view. And he knew what was going on. His eye wouldn't blink. His tongue went numb. Any kind of sound or noise coming through his headset was like needles going into his ear. He knew he was having another attack of Bell's palsy. But he was live on the air during a pay-per-view when it happened. And it just turned out to be this awful, awful weekend, this awful day for Jim Ross, who, upon returning to television the following March, was immediately turned heel. Thankfully, that was quickly abandoned, and he returned to his seat at the broadcast desk for the main event of WrestleMania 15 at the request of both Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock, who insisted, despite his appearance, that they wanted Jim Ross back at the desk doing commentary for their main event. And maybe they would have brought him back anyway. They always brought back Jim Ross. I'm sure he would have ended up back on commentary no matter what. But Stone Cold and The Rock had a lot to do with him coming back when he did, and possibly getting his job back in that role. 16 years ago this week, on December 5th, 2004, Macho Man Randy Savage made his final in-ring appearance for TNA Wrestling. It's kind of sad that the final matches for both Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man happened in TNA and not in front of a big crowd at a WWE pay-per-view. You know, in the company where they made a name for them. I mean, Savage had a name kind of, coming into WWE. Hogan was already a star in the AWA. It's not like nobody knew who they were. But obviously, they became nationally recognized megastars working for Vince McMahon in WWE. That's where they made their name as big as they became. It happened in the World Wrestling Federation. That's where they should have been able to end their career. I would feel the same way if there was a big TNA name who really made their name there and they went somewhere else. You could even say AJ Styles, would it be more appropriate for him to end his career in TNA? He probably wouldn't think so. But, in a way, yeah, it kind of would, because that's where he really made a name for himself. So that's why I find it sad that their final matches were in TNA, in front of a very small audience, and not where they belong, which was in WWE. Ric Flair did get his big WrestleMania retirement match against Shawn Michaels, but then he ruined it by going to TNA, and he wrestled a dozen more times. And Flair also wrestled his final match for TNA. He lost to Sting in 2011. And then the next month, Hogan lost to Sting in Bound for Glory. Yeah, that's crazy because, so I know Hogan did a couple of, or he was technically part of some six-man tags a few months after that, but Hogan's very last singles match, unless he comes back now for another match, and please let that not happen, but his last singles match was that loss to Sting at Bound for Glory. So think about that. Sting can lay claim to being the man who retired two of the biggest stars in the history of the business back-to-back. On back-to-back consecutive months in 2011, he had Ric Flair's last match and beat him there, and he had Hulk Hogan's last singles match and beat him there. No wonder The Undertaker didn't want to wrestle Sting. Now we know why. He was afraid. Savage had debuted at the previous TNA pay-per-view. I think it might have been Victory Road. He made an appearance at the very end of the very quick cameo at the end of the pay-per-view. And then 2 days later, after he made his debut, he abruptly quit the promotion after claiming an unsafe work environment because of a run-in he had backstage at the pay-per-view with his old friend, but no longer friend, Hulk Hogan, who was there visiting. Hogan was not wrestling at the time for TNA. I think he was an invited guest of Dixie Carter's father. So he was backstage just visiting, and I'm sure trying to figure out how he can use them for leverage on his next WWE deal. He did come back to WWE in early 05, so it actually might have worked. Hogan's a lot of things. He's not a dumb guy. He knows what he's doing. Savage, though, did not like Hogan. He was not on good terms with Hogan. He had a lot of heat with Hogan. Savage was said to have been there with Bryan Adams as his bodyguard, the wrestler, not the singer. He and Crush were very good friends for a number of years. And I guess he brought Crush along as something of his bodyguard. And for all the crap that Randy Savage was talking about Hulk Hogan at that time, I mean, he did a rap album and literally did a rap song where he basically did nothing but trash Hulk Hogan. He said, "Be a man, Hulk." I mean, he did not like Hogan. He made that very clear. He rapped about him. He issued challenges to him. Fight me, fight me. Fight me, we'll put, the money on the line for charity. He did not like Hogan. And for all the crap that Savage talked about Hogan, apparently he was backstage trying to be cordial. Savage wasn't buying any of it. And Hogan was the one, as I always heard the story, who made the comment like, hey, you know what? Let's take things outside. And Savage is the one who backed down from Hogan. And he walked away. Now, Bryan Adams was on a Tampa radio show immediately after all of this happened, calling TNA and the Jarretts unprofessional for sneaking Savage into the building as some secret while letting Hogan just walk in where fans could see him, and kind of making him making a big deal about him being there. I guess they felt it somehow made Savage look less than. In any event, cooler heads prevailed. And Savage did come back. He did a couple of TV shots for TNA. And then he was supposed to team up with Jeff Hardy and AJ Styles against Jeff Jarrett, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash at their Turning Point pay-per-view. This is, again, December of 2004. AJ Styles can say that he was part of both the Macho Man's and the Undertaker's final matches. So that's a nice little feather in his cap. Savage, by this point, was 52 years old. I know we were just talking earlier about Sting making his debut this week in AEW, and he's 61 with a bad neck. But Savage, at 52, he had the knees of an 82-year-old. He was not moving around good. Whatever his upper body may have looked like, and he worked out and did whatever he was doing, his knees were shot. And you could see it when he would walk around, that he couldn't do the things that he used to do. And that's what happens, when you have a career. I mean, Savage wasn't a cruiserweight, but he would fly around the ring. He would jump over the top rope when he would drape somebody's neck over the rope and always land on his feet. And he would come off the top rope with a double sledge, or he would come off the top rope with an elbow drop. You do enough of that over the course of, my God, 25 years, whatever it would have been, 30 years. And eventually it's going to take its toll. Coming off the top of that rickety cage in WCW at that one Halloween Havoc show, which was a stupid thing for him to do. And I covered that in the history segment a few weeks ago. And that did tremendous damage to his knees. And he still wrestled, but then many months later, he had to leave and have surgery done on both knees. And that was only, a few years before this. So all of it takes a toll. And he knew it. He knew he didn't look his best. And as Dusty Rhodes told Yahoo after Savage passed away, they interviewed him, and he was talking about, the Macho Man. He said the last words that Savage said to him, the last words that Savage said to Dusty, who was working backstage at the time for TNA, was, and this is 5 minutes, Dusty says, before the pay-per-view. 5 minutes before they're going on the air that night. Dusty says, Savage comes to him and says, I can't do this. I don't want people to see me looking like this. When Savage showed up in TNA, he was dressed in all black, head to toe. So you couldn't really see what his upper body looked like. He was balding, and evidently he was ashamed. He was ashamed by his appearance. Jerry Jarrett called in Keith Mitchell, who was the producer, and they came and they met with Dusty, and Dusty said to them, change the main event. And he told Randy, go home. It's okay with me. Just go home. And he said he could see it in his eyes. He just did not want to do it. He said Randy was financially set. He saved his money. A lot of guys blew their money. They were broke. That's why they had to do all the conventions and stuff, because they had no money. They didn't know how to manage or save their money. Savage was not like that. Savage was, I guess you could say, thrifty. And apparently, by all accounts, he was set. He was set. He was very good with his finances. And Dusty said he didn't have to do it. Financially, he was set. He goes, out of all of us from that era, Flair, me, Hogan, Andre, he said, how many of us walked away? Just one. That's Randy Savage. So to get Savage out of the match, they concocted this kidnapping angle to explain why he didn't come out. The match started. It was AJ Styles and Jeff Hardy, and there was no Randy Savage. Later on, though, Savage did show up. Obviously, he had a change of heart. Maybe he just felt, I committed myself. I have to do this. And he did show up. Came out at the very end of the match. He threw a couple of punches because he couldn't do anything else. And when Jeff Jarrett tried for a sunset flip, Savage punched him in the head. He sat down on top of him, and he won the match. So the idea was to have Savage wrestle Jeff Jarrett at the next pay-per-view for the NWA World Championship. And supposedly, Savage wanted to win the title. He insisted on winning the title from Jarrett. They didn't like that idea, so they had a creative disagreement. Savage never did appear again for TNA. Now, that story has never been confirmed as far as Savage insisting on winning the title, and that's the reason why he didn't come back. It's very possible. It's very possible. I've also heard that it may have had something to do with, he cited health issues. I can't do it. Because again, he was already having doubts. And maybe after that appearance, he realized that, you know what? I can't do this. So I don't know which version of that is correct. But he had no business being world champion at that point. Love the Macho Man, but he had no business being the champion. One thing is for sure. Even though he won his last match, the Macho Man's career deserved a better conclusion than that. But that wasn't even the main event. They rightfully headlined with a 6 Sides of Steel match that night at Turning Point between America's Most Wanted and Triple X, the team of Christopher Daniels and Elix Skipper. And this was the match where Elix Skipper pulled off one of the most athletic feats that I have ever seen to this day in a wrestling match. When he scaled the cage, he walked across the top beam of the cage, had nothing to hold on to, hands free, trying to balance himself, nearly lost his balance, and he hit a Rana, sending Chris Harris all the way down to the mat. Don West lost his mind, the fans in the building lost their minds, and I was losing their mind just going back and watching it again. Every few years, I'll come across a clip, or I'll go back and I'll watch that, and I lose my mind just like I saw it for the first time, because it is just, anytime I watch that spot back, it is still the #1 highlight spot in Impact history, in my opinion. I know they had a lot of Ultimate X matches, a lot of crazy stuff happened over the years. TNA now has been around. It's going to be 20 years soon. To me, that is still the #1 highlight, is that Elix Skipper Rana from the top of the cage. And that actually was an excellent main event. Had the show ended with the Savage thing, that would have been quite the letdown. But they did end on a high note that night. 14 years ago this week, on December 3rd, 2006, WWE presented one of its worst, if not the worst, pay-per-view show in its history. I am a little torn on this one, if it's this or King of the Ring in 1995, which was horrendous. But you know what? Even the worst In Your House pay-per-views, and there were some bad In Your House pay-per-views that year too, in 95. Even those weren't as bad as this, because they didn't charge you full price for those. Those In Your House shows were 2 hours for like $15. This was the infamous ECW December to Dismember show, which marked the demise of Paul Heyman's run in WWE at that time. Heyman wanted ECW's rising star, CM Punk. He saw big things in Punk's future. He wanted CM Punk to walk out with the championship that night, while Vince McMahon wanted Bobby Lashley to get his big crowning moment, and he wanted Bobby Lashley to walk out as the ECW champion. One guess as to who won out in that argument. Heyman's idea was to have Punk enter the main event, which was an Extreme Elimination Chamber match. The Big Show was ECW champion at that time, and Heyman's idea was to have Punk enter the Extreme Elimination Chamber first and quickly beat the Big Show. So I don't know if that meant that Punk would start the match with Big Show, or if Punk would be the first person out of one of the pods, but he would be, whatever that means, he would be the first one out, and in the first few minutes of the match, he would beat the Big Show with an Anaconda Vice. He would either tap him out or he would choke him out. And the Big Show was happy to oblige. Big Show was a physical wreck. He was massively overweight. His body was he was just beaten to shit. He was in so much pain. He was out of shape. He knew it. He had to take a break. He had to drop that belt and get out of there, and he knew it. And he told Heyman he loved the idea. He wanted to help make Punk a star, and he knew he was on his way out. This was going to be his only chance to do it. Because you would think, oh, Big Show, he's a big star. You know, is he going to be okay being first to be eliminated by this scrawny little up-and-comer? He was fine with it. At least that's what he claims. He says he was fine with it. But Vince McMahon insisted that Bobby Lashley go over. And on the argument backstage before the show, former WWE writer Andrew Goldstein has talked about the argument. He has described the argument between McMahon and Heyman like this. He says, Paul was adamant, said that we have to have Punk go over Big Show and put the title on this guy, and let's ride him. And Vince, whether it was a good idea or not, he says, because it came from Paul, we couldn't do it. So he said, Vince said, oh no, Lashley. Goes, gotta be Lashley. I'm going to make this my own. Paul, shut up. Not only did Punk not win the title, Vince made it so that he was the first one eliminated from the match, which pissed all the fans off because the fans wanted to see CM Punk win also. Lashley went on to win the championship. The fans were pissed. If I remember, because I couldn't bring myself to go back and watch it, I think there were even some fans in the front row who turned their back, I think, on Lashley after he won. People were not happy. And on top of all of that, people at home probably weren't happy either, although maybe they were, because mercilessly the show was over. But they paid for a full pay-per-view. And the WWE pay-per-views went 3 hours, right? Or maybe they would go 2 hours and 45 minutes, 2 hours and 50 minutes. But they paid for a full show. Whatever the price, it was probably $40 or $50. And the show went off the air over half an hour early. It was a 2 hours and 17 minutes they went off the air because they didn't have enough time. They didn't have enough stuff to fill time. This was before the WWE Network where you just get everything for $10. And half the time now I'm begging for these shows to go off the air early. I would kill for that. That's not how things were back then. The undercard featured some great pay-per-view worthy bouts, like Balls Mahoney against Matt Striker, Tommy Dreamer against Daivari, and Kelly Kelly teaming with Mike Knox against Kevin Thorne and Ariel. Heyman knew the show sucked. He knew it. He knew the show sucked. He made his thoughts known throughout the entire day, which only made Vince mad. Paul knew that they were going to go on the air or go off the air short. He could tell. He looked at the rundown. He looked at the matches and the match times. He said, "We're going to go off the air early here. We're going to come up short." And when he brought it up to Vince, it only made him more irate. You would think that Vince would go like, "Oh, that's a good point. Let's let's come up with something to fill time, it only made him angrier. That Heyman was, coming up with all these complaints about this, that, and the other. What a fun guy to work for. Years later on Steve Austin's podcast, Heyman called it an indescribably bad show. The next day, Heyman took the fall for that bad show. He had a closed-door meeting with Vince McMahon and Stephanie McMahon, and he was dismissed. And he left the meeting, and people said that he wasn't selling it. I mean, he looked like everything was all normal and okay, but he collected his stuff and he went home, and he didn't show back up in the company again for probably another 6 years until Brock Lesnar came back. But somebody had to fall on the sword, and that somebody wasn't going to be Vince McMahon, so it turned out to be Paul Heyman. And 6 years ago this week, on December 1st, 2014, the Stone Cold podcast premiered live on the WWE Network after Monday Night Raw, and Austin's very first guest, he got the biggest get that you could possibly get. It was his greatest rival, the chairman of the board, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, was doing a rare podcast appearance. I believe it did air live. I don't believe it was pre-recorded. Some highlights included Vince apologizing for firing CM Punk on his wedding day. Oops. My bad. It's basically what his answer was. Well, he said, in a big company like that, sometimes wires get crossed, and he goes, it was not done intentionally. That's what he claims. It is a big company, and wires can get crossed. But if you believe that CM Punk, FedEx? I think he got his termination papers FedExed, I think, to him on his wedding day, which was many months after, or at least a few months after he walked out on the company. Well, you could choose to believe that, but I find that very hard to believe. But he apologized for it. He was trying to be the bigger man. He apologized for that. Austin was asking about current talent walking around backstage on eggshells, being afraid to piss anybody off. What is your advice to those folks on the roster? And Vince McMahon's advice to them? Well, don't piss anybody off. He called them millennials who are not as ambitious as the rosters of the past, like the one that Austin was a part of. He said the last person to really reach for that imaginary brass ring that he loves to talk about was John Cena. He had to go back in his mind and find, who can I go back to as the last person to reach for that brass ring, like they're Sonic the Hedgehog. And he had to go all the way back to John Cena. Talk about burying your own roster. Holy shit. He was asked about Cesaro. Why is he not a bigger star? Why are you not pushing it? What's going on here? And Vince suggested that he's not connecting with the audience because he doesn't have the charisma. And I quote, maybe because he's Swiss. I don't know in terms of the European style. End quote. Not even sure what the fuck that means. Because he's Swiss. When Austin pressed him, he admitted that it was his call to end the Undertaker's undefeated streak at WrestleMania. He said Macho Man Randy Savage would for sure be going into the Hall of Fame, which he did a few months later. Of course, he waited until he was dead to put him in, which I'll never forgive him for. And when asked if he ever plans to retire, he said that he works as many hours now as he ever has. He said that he doesn't think he has lost a step physically or mentally, and that people who say that he's out of touch are just critics. Most importantly, he said, he listens to the audience because it is important to give them what they want. And I thought that we would end this segment appropriately with a dose of comedy. And that is this week in wrestling history.